And that left us with the four alternatives you see here. And when we last met back in January of 2012, that's where we were at. So now we're picking up with the environmental assessment of these final two alternatives. At that meeting too, we also addressed facility type. And we looked at three different alternatives. One is arterial. What's an example of an arterial? Veterans Parkway in town is an arterial. We looked at expressway. An expressway, an example would be Route 51 south of Bloomington. It's not interstate type, you still have access, but it is a little higher type facility than an arterial. And then we also have freeway, and a freeway is an interstate type facility. What we moved forward with at this time was a freeway. A freeway is safer because it only allows access at interchanges. Expressways may have driveways that would create conflict points and increase risk of crashes. The more access points you have, the higher your likelihood of accidents goes up. Speed variance between farm vehicles and other vehicles on an expressway renders it less safe than a freeway. A lot of the studies that we have found says the issue of width isn't as much of an issue for farm vehicles as the difference in speed between how fast a farm vehicle drives and how fast a motorcycle or another vehicle drives. And so when we go to the alignment analysis, elimination took us down to the four remaining alternatives. We are now in 2013. We want to present a preferred alternative, but we want public input from you. Since we last met, what we did is we developed some focus working groups. And these are some smaller groups that look at specific issues. And it's an advisory group with specific interests and knowledge. They review specific planning and design materials. And the member selection occurred in a fair and transparent manner. And to be honest, anyone who asked to be in a focus working group was in a focus working group. We didn't turn down anyone. We had three focus working groups. They were very helpful. Some things changed on what we were looking at based upon their input. And I see various representatives of those groups here today. We have the Land Use and Access Management Group. They looked at residential access, farmland impacts, interchange types, intersection locations, and future land use. We also had an alternative modes group that looked at bike issues, pedestrian issues, safety, access, and utilization of existing systems. And then we have the sustainability group. They looked at best measurement practices, aesthetics, ecology, and landscaping. This is when we last left, this is what we had, but there have been some revisions made to this based upon work with the focus working group. What you see in purple is where we're at now. What you see as yellow is where we left off. And let me walk through what these changes are. First, up at the crossing of I-55 and East Side Highway connection to Northtown Road, now that we're down to just a few alternatives, we can do a lot more detailed analysis, and the footprint of that interchange, we were able to reduce in size. We also reduced the size of the interchange at the East Side Highway and Towanda Barnes Road North, just south of Towanda. Up in this location, near County Road 2000, as the East Side Highway crosses Fort Jesse, originally we had a little jog in the East Side Highway to avoid the impacts to some homes. However, the interchange footprint still gets into those homes, so we said there's not really nothing is accomplished by doing that unless we go much farther to the east. And when we go much farther to the east, that just gets more expensive than the value of the properties themselves. So we straightened that out. When we last met, there were no interchanges at General Electric Road. However, since that time, it's been decided that there should be access to an East Side Highway and GE Road. We also changed where the divergence point is of this eastern and western alternative. Originally, that divergence point was right at Cheney's Grove Road, but when we move it up to north of Ireland Grove Road, we're able to greatly reduce the impact of Ireland Grove Road interchange, and it gets farther away from the grove. Perhaps one of the bigger changes is down here. Originally, we had an interchange at 150 and at Towanda Barnes Road. However, those interchanges are too close to each other. They don't meet IDOT standard for spacing, so we had to have a different configuration, kind of a collector distributor or split diamond. I know that's technical, but the project study group said, well, we don't want to do that because that gets complicated. If we can move that interchange to Cheney's Grove Road, we now have adequate spacing between the interchanges, and we don't have to do anything unique. when the interchanges are too close together, when you have to get off onto the interstate or onto the freeway and back on, you have too little distance to weave with existing traffic. And when that space is too short, you tend to see crashes go up. So when we moved it up to James Grove Road, that worked out better. This blue line right here is not a program project, but it's planned for the future. It's the extension of Hamilton Road, which will eventually connect down to James Grove Road. And then our last change was down here at I-74. This was one of the several changes that came from our land use and access management group. Originally, an East Side Highway connected down to Long Lane Road, right here. But what that did, it came to our attention from the land use and access management group, that road is used for a lot of farm vehicles. And if that connects to the East Side Highway, farm vehicles would have to get on East Side Highway, get off at 150 to get back onto where Long Lane Road was. However, for a freeway, farm vehicles can't use it. They aren't allowed on the interstate. The land use access, the 2035 land use plan shows growth up in this area, so it did make sense to connect an East Side Highway to there. But down here, it's still slated as just agriculture. So it no longer makes sense to have a connection beyond I-74. And as a result, instead of a full cloverleaf, we just have what's called a trumpet, which will connect to 74, but there will be no connection further south. So these are the remaining alternatives. There are 4 of them that we moved forward with. One is 124, which uses the western core area and connects to Northtown Road. Another is 125, uses the eastern and connects to Northtown Road. The third is 126, western Z-Bar connection, and 127, eastern and Z-Bar connection. This is a diagram, and we have an exhibit there. The typical cross-section will be an interstate-type facility, approximately 55 feet from edge to edge here. But from our alternate modes group, we are adding a bike trail along the west side of the East Side Highway. It will be separated by an access control fence, but that will follow the East Side Highway for its entire length, north and south. For the environmental assessment, again, we looked at all these categories, and as we're able to get into more and more detailed design, we're able to add more elements. As has been the case before, we had resources that weren't impacted, resources that were impacted but weren't differentiated, and those that were differentiated, and there were numerous ones. For example, here's one that influenced what remains right now. We have wetland impacts. Up here along Northtown Road, there is a wetland that gets into the future I-55 Northtown East Side Highway connection. We also had some operational impacts. We spoke earlier about the skewed interchange, how we prefer to have it at a 90 degrees. This is at 90. This, I believe, is at a 30 degree skew. And the issue with that is what it has to cross. It has to cross 2 lanes of existing I-55. It has to cross historic Route 66, along with the future bike trail that's going to be between Route 66 and the interstate. It also has to cross 3 rails of high-speed rail. I don't know if anywhere you were at the public information meeting last year, but there's going to be 3 rails right there. And that becomes very complex to cross all of that with the bridge structure. And for this reason, and for the wetlands, we eliminated the Northtown Road connections. So that leaves us with just 2 alternatives now. We also, now we have a map there that shows all the different impacts. We have a table that has all that information, and it's in your packet too, because of what we have to look at. We have to look at special waste impacts. We have to look at residential impacts. We look at business impacts. Utility impacts right down here as the eastern and western alternative diverges. Noise receptors, we check all. Noise receptor is any home, any business, any church within 500 feet of the edge of pavement. So for the entire remaining alternatives, we look at that. Farmland preservation. The pink area right here is the limits of the 2035 land use plan. So if that comes to fruition with the growth that's occurring, you could say that would be the corporate limits of Bloomington Normal, and you would have residential and commercial growth all the way out to that area. We have a map of that in the back. Now, one thing we look at for farmland preservation is we measure the distance between the East Side Highway and that alternative, such as you see right here. Because you could argue that that farmland becomes subject to development and you take farmland out of production then. So the greater that green area is, the worse that is for sustainability in terms of maintaining farmland. This is 126 right here, and this is 127, as you'd expect. The farther out it is, the more farmland is potentially jeopardized. We also identify highly erodible soils. Now this is a table of just agricultural impacts. And you see something like this in the handout you have. This is alternative 126 and alternative 127. And it identifies the differences between them. What you see in blue is the higher number. Some of these are truly differentiating, some of them not so much. For example, uneconomic remnants. And uneconomic remnants is a parcel that's been separated to where only 5 acres or less remains in the parcel in one corner. That's considered not farmable almost, so we consider that an uneconomic remnant. For 127, there's 25 of those. For 126, there's 23. Considering that this is about a 12-mile long roadway, that's not really differentiating. Those numbers are pretty close to each other. Some of these are, some of these aren't. So the remaining alternatives, we have 126 and 127. Now, of note, so you're familiar, we have an exhibit for this. Sometimes the East Side Highway goes over the road it's intersecting, sometimes the East Side Highway goes under. The overpasses, where an East Side Highway goes over where it's crossing, it will go over I-55, it will go over the railroad down here, it will go over Towanda Barnes Road, over 150, and it goes over 74. For the underpasses, where the east-west street goes over an East Side Highway, or the minor road goes over. Towanda Barnes will go over the East Side Highway. All of these east-west, Fort Jesse, GE, Empire, Oakland, and Ireland Grove Road. Those east-west roads will go over the East Side Highway. Cheney's Grove will go over the East Side Highway also. Now, what we want from you, we have a handout right here that explains some of the process. It also has a diagram of the remaining alternatives. It also has a table of all the impacts and the number, the difference of impacts between 126 and 127. It also has a glossary explaining what all these impacts is, explaining what a wetland is, and an economic remnant, etc. What we'd like you to do, there is a last page here, a comment form to fill out. You can fill it out here, put it in the box during the meeting. You can rip the page out, fold it to us, and mail it to us. You can email it to us. You can go to the webpage and download this, or you can fax it to us. That information is on the webpage. Tomorrow morning, we will be updating the webpage with all this information. We're also going to be updating, if you've been there before, we have an interactive map where you can zoom in with the remaining alternatives. So we anticipate sometime tomorrow our website will probably crash because last time it did the day after the meeting because so many people viewed that. But we'll get it back up. This is what the form looks like. So our goal here is to gather your information, summarize it, and present it in September to the Federal Highway Administration with the recommendation of the preferred alternative. Now, a couple points I want to bring up about what type of study this is. This is an environmental assessment. There are 3 types of study. The first is a categorical exclusion. That means the project you're working on is not going to impact anything. An example of that would be an intersection improvement, something very small. The most impactful would be an environmental impact statement where we know there will be significant impacts to the environment and we're trying to minimize that. Between the two is an environmental assessment, and that's what this study is. We know there's impacts, but we don't think they are significant. So our goal is to demonstrate at the end that there are no significant impacts, finding of no insignificant impacts, which is essentially called the findings nickname. If we do find significant impacts, then this study moves into an environmental impact statement, which is a much larger type of study. Right now, the thought is that's not going to happen. So what we want you to do is fill out this form. What we will, if you go out there, we have exhibits of a lot of what we've shown here. We also have a video, if you go far to the east side, of a 2035 vision of what would happen if the 2035 land use plan comes to fruition and where an East Side Highway will lay around there. Because one of the comments we receive a lot is, why are we studying East Side Highway? There's nothing out there on the east side. And today that's true, but in 2035 that's not going to be true. And if we wait till 2035 to study this, if that growth comes, it will be very difficult to determine a good location for an East Side Highway, because then the impacts to homes, residences, business will be tenfold. So we're trying to plan this at this time. Our goal is to be completed in 2014. At the end of this study, we will have an identified center line and corridor where an East Side Highway will go. A question we get a lot is, when will construction start on this? Funding only exists for this environmental assessment. The next step would be to develop construction plans. The plans you hand to a contractor to build. That will take several years for this size of study, a 12-mile study. After that, you have to secure right-of-way, and that will be difficult. After that, you start construction. All those take time. Even if money were available for those next phases of study, we'd be 6-7 years away from turning dirt. And right now, there is no funding for this project beyond this study. Ideally, we hear there will no longer be earmarks, there will no longer be high priority funding. The only way you get funding for major projects is through Tiger Grants, which is a fiercely competitive process that has to demonstrate true economic benefit to the community. You can go to the webpage, eastsidehighway.com. Tomorrow we will have all this information. You'll be able to download the exhibits, the presentation, and this form. If you have friends that weren't able to make it, please direct them to the webpage to download the form. We'd like all the forms in by July 3rd. We will take all of them, we'll summarize that, we'll update on the webpage. If you have questions or comments, we will address everyone. Now, since we sent the postcard out, since we sent the email out, we've already started receiving questions. If any of you are here, we will eventually get to those questions after we receive everyone's comments. And we'll post all of them on the webpage.